Hello, everyone, and welcome to the call. My name is Lauren Berkman, and I will be your tech host for today.
My name is Kathy Fun. I use the pronouns she, her, and today I'll be going through the introduction to redistricting. As Elena mentioned before, all of the materials can be found on our website, www.redistrictingcommunitycollege.com. And so you can follow along today, but don't worry if you miss some notes, you'll also be able to go back and find those slides as well as eventually a recording of this video. So next, where are we? We are in part 1 of a 6-part curriculum. Next, and we'll be talking now about a couple different things. What is redistricting? Why does it matter? And why do we organize to put our community on the map? Next. So let's start with what is redistricting. Redistricting is when we draw lines so that each district has the same number of people. The US Constitution requires that political districts of the same type have the same number of people. This is called the principle of population equality. You'll sometimes see the term equipopulous, equal population. Sometimes you'll even hear the phrase one person, one vote. At every level of redistricting, this is the first rule that has to be followed. The goal of population equality is to make sure that each legislator is representing the same number of people. So let's say we have a city with 20 people. Next. In this city, we have 4 council districts. So you take the total population of the city, 20, you divide it by the total number of districts, here it's 4, and you get the ideal population for each district, 5. You are aiming to have 5 people in each district to have population equality. Now notice I said people. In redistricting, we draw districts using the total number of people. We do not exclude people based on citizenship or age. This rule of drawing districts with equal population applies to all levels of government, whether that's congressional, your state legislature, your county, your city council, or even school board districts. Next. Over time, children are born, people pass away, people move. And that means that sometimes places have population growth and other places have decreases in population. So for example, in times of economic crisis, people might be moving from places where they were renting to cheaper places where they can find housing prices or renting prices that are much more affordable. Or they might be bunking up with family and friends, as we saw during the COVID crisis. Because of this, districts become uneven in size in population during the course of a decade. Next. So every 10 years, the federal government counts everyone in the country. That's called the census. We just did it, and it ended October 15th, 2020. After the census is finished, the district boundaries have to be redrawn to even out the number of people in each district, and that's called redistricting. In our city of 20, it has now grown to a population of 24 in the last 10 years. Next. It did not grow evenly, and so new district lines have to be drawn. Those are the lines in purple, replacing the old ones. And the new census population numbers now have each district containing 6 people. Next. Redistricting has always been used as a tool of politics to solidify power. In this example, we have a minority community that happens to live in the center of the state. Next. Now, the people who are drawing the districts might be aiming to draw districts that are perfectly compact, that is, square. But because the lines are drawn without regard to where this minority community is, or maybe it is in the intention of maximizing the votes of other people, the minority population is split into 4. This minority community cannot elect a candidate of their choice because now they're only 1/4 of each district and their votes are diluted. Next. But things could be different. If we draw the districts a different way, this community could unite to tell the line drawers to pay attention to where they are. Next. And now the lines are drawn to take into consideration the community testimony, and they've been made whole. The minority population makes up over 3/4 of the population in this middle district. After equal population, the next most important rule of redistricting is the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act can be used to provide protection to racial and ethnic minorities in a situation like this one. Now, what kind of district you end up drawing, that's a more nuanced question. And we'll be talking in much greater detail about the Voting Rights Act and how it works in part 2 of the Redistricting Community College curriculum. This is the same concept, basically, as also thinking about communities of interest. The definition of communities of interest is much broader. It can be people who share a common language, people who are all farmers, people whose health is impacted by a nearby factory, or people who in some way share culture and concerns in a way where unifying them into a district would enable them to have better representation. Next. Now let's look at a real life situation. Using your chat box at the bottom of your menu, click on that and tell us, what community do you think this picture is from? I'll give it a second. Some of you may have watched this presentation before and you might know the answer. And I'm going to give you all gold stars. I will say increasingly as I show this picture, because of the recent events, lots of people have said, Houston, Texas, Alice, somewhere cold, yes. Louisiana, Katrina, good question. Not the South. Yes. All right. So the UK. Somebody's looking really closely at that slide and looking for clues. This area is actually, this picture is taken from Watts, and it's a neighborhood in Los Angeles, which if anybody knows Southern California, you know that Los Angeles is not used to this kind of weather event. This community of Watts is historically a Black neighborhood with a large and growing Latino population. Next. Now, on November 12th, 2003, a freak storm dumped over 5 inches of rain, snow, and hail on Watts, and it overwhelmed the storm drains and flooded out the houses. What ended up happening was that 150 buildings and homes were crushed under this snow. 50,000 people lost power. People had to go to emergency centers. People had to be rescued from waist-deep water and snow. And many people lost everything they had. They had no place to live. All their possessions were flooded out. They couldn't even get to their work because the roads were clogged and their cars had been frozen. Leaders went to their elected representatives to ask for help, but it took an inordinate amount of time for anybody to respond. And why is that? Unfortunately, redistricting played a role in that. Next. So you can see here in this map, Watts is split into 3 different districts. Watts is the little area in green, that's the neighborhood. And the red lines are the district lines for congressional districts. So when community residents went to ask for help, no one congressional representative was standing up to call for federal emergency aid because everybody had a small piece of Watts, but nobody was particularly responsible for all of the community. Next. Unfortunately, that redistricting division existed not only at the congressional level, but at the state level. In state Senate seats and state assembly seats, Watts was split into 3 different districts. No wonder they couldn't get any representation. Next. So the community leaders of Watts, when they went to go ask for assistance from Congress to declare a federal emergency to help them rebuild, they weren't getting any attention because they were split into 3 districts. In fact, we talked to one congressional staffer who worked for one of those congressional members, And he says he remembers when the residents of Watts came in to ask for assistance. They actually had looked at the map and they'd figured out how many residents were in their district. And those residents were bounced from one congressional office to another because no one represented them and nobody felt entirely responsible for the care of that community. Romulo Rivera said, this would never have happened if Watts belonged all to one district. Next. In 2011, the leaders united to testify about Watts before the California Redistricting Commission. As a result, Watts was made whole. And for the first time in this new 44th district, you can see the green lines are where the new district lines are. The 44th Congressional District elected a Latina, Nanette Barragan, the first Latina to ever be elected to represent this district. We'll talk a little bit more about community mapping in part 3 of the Redistricting Community College curriculum. Next. As you learn more about redistricting, you'll want to think about the level of redistricting your organization wants to get involved in. Is it congressional? Is it state? Do you want to get involved in local redistricting? Each level may have different rules and timelines. In section 4, we'll be talking a little bit about the timelines and rules. We'll give some examples of a few states, but we'll also share resources that can help you find out more about redistricting in your own state and local area. Today, we'll also talk about the rules and timelines of redistricting, how to prepare testimony and advocacy, and how to build a coalition. These are just some of the questions that you're going to want to start thinking about right now as you prepare for all of the information that we're going to be sharing with you. Next. Once you've decided which level of government you're interested in focusing in on, you can research key questions like, will there be public hearings and when will those happen? Who makes those mapping decisions? Are there elected lawmakers who are making those decisions, or is it a commission, or is it a variation of both of these? How do we submit information to these decision makers? And is the process fair? In part 5 of the Redistricting Community College curriculum, we'll be talking about the strategies for giving amazing testimony and for watchdogging the process to make sure that it's inclusive and open. We'll have worksheets and a handbook as well that you can look at to find more information on the Redistricting Community College website. And next, last but not least, the key to changing district maps is to build strong coalitions. In part 6, we'll be talking about how to build strong alliances and coalitions to give power to your advocacy. You'll always want to ask who else should be at the table to describe our community and who else should be at our table as allies so that we can build strength in numbers. Next slide. Redistricting starts with good community organizing. Communities can get involved in redistricting by telling the story of your communities. And you are well on the way to organizing to being heard. You've heard the story of Watts. How would you describe your community? You have the knowledge and relationships to tell your community's story best. Nobody else. Now I'd like to introduce Jamal and Eduardo to teach us a little bit about the Voting Rights Act.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Jamal Watkins, Senior Vice President of Strategy and Advancement at the NAACP. And I believe, Eduardo, you are on and we're going to get started.
Absolutely. Hi, everybody. I am Eduardo Sainz. I'm the National Field Director for Mi Familia Vota. It's such a pleasure to be here today with every single one of you all. So we're going to talk about redistricting and understand the intersections of the Voting Rights Act. So we know that we want to make sure that we center, there's a couple of individuals that have been at the forefront with redistricting, and we also have a lot of work from now until 2022. There will be a couple of items that we're going to be talking today: the minority vote dilution, the federal protection from the 1965 Voting Rights Act, also the focus on ongoing efforts from communities of interest, and also community organizations like Mi Familia Vota and the NAACP. Next slide. So we want to do an icebreaker to get the conversation started. So I would ask everybody to please take a few moments and either get your phone, your tablet, open a new tab in your computer, and start thinking about the different districts that you currently live on. There are a couple of examples. We have districts that represent our city council and mayor. We have districts that represents our school, counties. Also at the state level, we have state house, state senate, and we also have what it's called the U.S. Senate, the congressional delegations that we send to Washington. And we also have 2 U.S. senators that represents every single state across the country. So let's take a moment and take a look at that. So we'll give you all about 1.5 minutes to look at your different districts. Start thinking about geographically, how do they look like? Is there intersections on the different districts? And I also want to see if individuals have the opportunity to power map the different elected officials that are currently serving in these districts.
We want to do a little bit of a deep dive into how all of this adds up and really unpack a concept called minority vote dilution. And when we think about how maps are drawn in districts, we know that in many ways, there's a lot of ways to draw different maps, if you will, based upon populations. So if you were to imagine in a community, you had 50 people, 60% of them were orange, 40% purple. I know that's a little bit cheesy in terms of colors, but think people, and if you were to draw a map, really, dividing up those people, into different segments, there's ways that you can draw maps that are proportionate, meaning it's pretty much fair, if you will. And you could have, 3 orange groupings, 2 purple groupings. You also could have it where it's a hybrid in sort of this proportionality where you have 3 orange and 2 purple groupings, but you mix up the people, if you will, and group them in different ways. But on the sort of other end of the spectrum, there's ways to draw maps where it's not fair, where you have, in one example here, you draw maps where the majority of the groupings benefit one community, say the orange folks, or you do it in a way where it's disproportionate and the majority of the groupings benefit, say, the purple folks, the purple people. And when we start to think about maps, and as Martha was talking about being in this Venn diagram, we're really centering ourselves with identifying what does it mean to draw maps that are fair or equitable or inclusive. And that brings us to the notion of, the intentionality of drawing maps. And in communities of color, we have seen historically practices commonly known as packing and cracking that actually occur to dilute the voting strength of a particular community. And in this case, it would be communities of color. Redistricting has been used at times to prevent minority voters from gaining political power by drawing districts in ways that have resulted in voters having less of a chance of electing their candidates of choice. In fact, when you look at districts are usually drawn based upon the cohesion of like-minded groups, if you will. Not necessarily the shapes of the districts matter so much as, how do you allow for folks who live in a certain geography to have the opportunity to elect a candidate of their choice? And in the cases of minority vote dilution, what you see is that drawers use techniques such as packing and cracking to actually dilute the ability of these communities to be able to pick a candidate of their choice. And so I want to unpack a little bit around packing. And when you think about the term packing, it's a term used when minority voters are compressed into smaller numbers of districts to really, waste or diminish their collective strength instead of effectively controlling one district or more. And an example, listed here, and we're going to make sure you all get this content. Imagine, if you will, there was some blue wards and some gray wards, 60% blue, 40% gray. Think about the purple people, the orange people. You can draw a map in a way where you can pack one grouping into specific districts so that you literally dilute their ability to have the choice to choose their electors, if you will. And there's different ways that that can play out. And an example of this is when map makers draw one district that is over 90% of a single minority group, when they could draw two districts in this model that have 50% of a single minority group. And so it's making choices. And in a real world example, we were on a call with the folks in Atlanta, Georgia, talking redistricting. And they said for Georgia, you see packing happening in the Atlanta metro area because that's where the majority of the population of people of color live. And so one of the strategies has been from folks who are manipulating maps is to pack those communities into districts so that you dilute their ability to have a vote choice, if you will. But then there's the other side, which is called cracking. And it really is this notion of splitting apart the areas of minority voters into thinly into districts known as cracking, splitting or fracturing. And it's the opposite of packing. And there's many ways that this plays out, but it's still that sort of notion that if you're drawing a map and you're manipulating the numbers, you can create it to where you break up the strength of that community by having it, literally cracked apart, if you will. And using Georgia as an example, that same conversation around Atlanta, the folks in the field were saying, now you have this issue of packing in Atlanta, the Atlanta metro area, but outside of Atlanta, you see cracking. So in smaller communities in parts of Georgia, think Albany, Savannah, and even smaller cities, Rome, Augusta, cracking was the strategy because it was meant to dilute, from another perspective, the voting strength of communities of color. And so in one state, you saw trends of packing and cracking happening deliberately to manipulate the vote, if you will. So what's the remedy to this? What's the federal remedy? Are there protections here? I'm curious as to those that are on the Zoom, raise your hand or wave your hand if you are an attorney, an operative, or the Voting Rights Act like the back of your hand. You know it really well. You've played with it. I see some folks waving your hands, Gary and others. So when we get to the part where we do Q&A and discussion, we want you to lean in a little bit more, but I am not a lawyer. And so I'm gonna walk through the Voting Rights Act and throw up some of the framework, but wanna make sure that we ground it in how, the Voting Rights Act being passed at the height of the civil rights movement in 1965 was a way to prevent the systematic and widespread voter discrimination experienced by people of color. Now, some of you may remember Lyndon Baines Johnson. I wasn't around then, but under his watch, the Voting Rights Act was really considered to be one of the single most important federal statutes protecting the right to vote. Now, the act itself contains several important provisions. One of the provisions, Section 5, who we all know was gutted during the Shelby County versus Holder Supreme Court decision. That section was a section that really maintained that certain states would have to get pre-approval or pre-clearance before changing things in regards to voting rights in their states. That section is gone, it's gutted. We're looking for a fix, but Section 2 still stands. And Section 2 was really adopted essentially as an enforcement mechanism for the 15th Amendment's guarantee that the right to vote cannot be abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And it allowed for voters to seek judicial relief if they believed that a state or local government had denied or limited their voting rights on the basis of base, color, or membership in a language minority group. Very clear, it's a protection. And when you think about Section 2, there's case law that shows how it got even further nuanced and developed. It was amended in 1982, and it really lifted up, the requirements that the results in the abridgment of the right to vote on account of a voter's race, color, or language minority status was unlawful, whether the intent to discriminate could be proven or not. So if it was an unintended racialized outcome or an intended racialized outcome, Section 2 applies. That's a win. That's a victory in sort of augmenting the law. We also saw further revisions to the statute that whether a discriminatory result had occurred requires the totality of circumstances to determine whether or not the challenged voting restriction actually abridge protected voters' ability to participate equally in elections and to elect a representative of their choice. That's a lot, that's a mouthful. But that notion of totality of circumstances was also amended into the statute to further develop it. But at the end of the day, Section 2 has really given rise to two types of cases, one around vote dilution and one around vote deprivation claims. But in terms of vote dilution, it literally is the thing that we're focusing in on that gives us some protection from things like packing and cracking as it relates to the drawing of maps through the Voting Rights Act. I'm going to lift up a few more nuances in that, we really want to be crystal clear that there's case law that has made this section stronger. In 1986, Thornburg versus Gingles established that affected minority groups, literally are sufficiently large to elect a representative of its choice, that the minority group is politically cohesive, and that the white majority voters vote sufficiently as a bloc to usually defeat the minority group's preferred candidates, allowed for a clarifying, if you will, of the test for vote dilution as a claim. And then in subsequent cases, there was even more nuances that allowed for, this statute to really be strong in terms of the extent of the law. And so as we think about the conclusion of at least Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, I know you all can read this on your own, and you'll get this as a textual aid. And folks like Gary, you don't need it because you know it, but the criteria for majority minority districts protected under Section 2 of the VRA is designed to ensure people are in districts that literally give them a fair chance of electing candidates of their choice. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act literally protects certain criteria for drawing majority minority districts. This includes that the minority group is sufficiently large and geographically concentrated to make up a majority district. It includes that the minority group is politically cohesive. This means that the individuals that make up the group vote in a similar pattern, e.g. that they usually vote for the same candidates. It also includes that the white majority usually votes together to defeat the minority preferred candidates. That's a qualifier. And it includes, given the totality of circumstances listed above, that the minority group has less opportunity than other members of the electorate to participate in the electoral process and to elect representatives of its choice. It's really this notion of equity, if you will, as a standard when drawing maps. Other types of districts include minority coalition districts, crossover districts, and influence districts. Now, if your eyes are glazing over and you're saying, Jamal, this is a lot, I'm not a lawyer, I don't know what to do, there is hope out there in the world in that many of our organizations have legal teams, general counsel, in-house lawyers, and then there are partner organizations that do this work in a deeper way so that if we have to get into the weeds and the nuances, we can. But for the most part, the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, provides a vehicle, if you will, for protections as it relates to deliberate packing and cracking and the sort of racialized gerrymandering, if you will, of maps. Again, remember, back to what Martha lifted up, we're in this Venn diagram and we live in the nexus of many maps. There are folks who are literally drawing maps, some with good intentions, some with not. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Eduardo to talk through an example of a congressional district in Arizona that sort of lifts up the notion of a majority minority district. Eduardo?
Yes, thank you so much, Jamal, for the presentation. And again, it's so wonderful to be here with all of you all. So we wanted to talk about the Arizona Congressional District 3. So we'll go into the next slide. And Arizona Congressional District covers the southern part of our wonderful state of Arizona, has a very diverse community, has a an average population of Latinos around 30%, has representation on native land. It also has representation on Black and white communities. So Arizona 3rd Congressional District is a district that contains, again, the southern border and shares border with California and also close border with our wonderful neighbors with Texas. Much of their district population is within the western part of Tucson, which is the second largest city in the state, and it's currently represented by Congressman Raul Grijalva. So again, on the right, we can see the population, close to 700,000 individuals, gender, close to a close split in the different population of race, unemployment, the median household income, etc. So we'll go into the next slide. And in order to ensure that we have maps like this one, we want to make sure that there is a fair objectives. We want to ensure that that we draw these equitable and inclusive maps that ensure that voters of color have an opportunity to elect candidates of their choice, which includes the Latino community, natives, African Americans, the Asian Pacific and Islander, etc. We want to make sure that there's the change of rules where possible. We also can defend the rules that were necessary through, sometimes we have to do litigation, and do advocate and ignite to shape the debate, create a political demand, and push the right for narrative. And in order, also another point to create the fair maps is to have a fair count with the census, like the one that we just had a couple of in 2020. So that's so important to ensure that we have an opportunity of representation across the different maps that we draw and the different districts that are going to be taking into account in our communities. And again, we do this by education to engage the general public, advocates and activists through our various channels, and how to impact the drawing of equitable maps through understanding the state and local political and demographic landscape, leveraging communities, partnerships, spaces, and approaches like communities of interest. We also do a lot of training to provide technical training on the use of tabular data and other data sets to assess and draw maps. This will be for a niche grounding, but understanding the range of tools and resources that are essential to empowering communities' engagement. Advocacy to continue to advocate for fair and inclusive maps, and the end of packing, cracking, and prison gerrymandering to lift up redistricting community engagement at the grassroots and grass-top level, and also litigation to intervene through the courts when and where necessary.
Thank you, Eduardo. And as we think about the notion of majority-minority districts, if you will, and intentionally drawing districts that are racially equitable and inclusive, there's a couple of ways in which communities are doing it. There's the community mapping angle, but there's also an approach known as communities of interest. And so we want to walk, and this is a teaser because there's a deeper dive training that will go into communities of interest, but to point out that we are focusing in on ongoing efforts, which is really about independent redistricting based upon an approach known as communities of interest. And by definition, a community of interest is a neighborhood, community, or group of people who have a common policy concern and would benefit from being maintained in a single district. And their policy concern is not singular, it's plural, but it's the notion of making sure that there's some type of community cohesion thought through when drawing maps. Now, I found this cartoon to be eye-opening. I wouldn't call it funny, a little disturbing, but it shows how when someone can intentionally gerrymander a map, it literally can cut other folks out. And so, the notion is we don't want any community members to be left out of really being able to engage with the drawing of their map. And I literally keep going back to Martha and being a part of that Venn diagram. What does your map in terms of your political representation need to look like? What should it look like? And for a lot of state efforts, it's a focus at this point. It's currently lifted up in HR 1, the For the People Act legislation, and reflected in S1, which is the Senate companion legislation. And it really is a big step forward in addressing and preventing extreme, intentional minority vote dilution and helping to mobilize communities, bringing folks together to really wrestle with what does it mean to have a district drawn that reflects who we are, what we believe collectively, and how it reflects our vote choices, if you will, into the future. Now, I want to give a footnote that this approach is not a guaranteed fix for racial exclusion. And so when you think about the notion of geographic segregation, if you will, communities of color in many cases are still clustered in cities, in urban communities, if you will, while their white counterparts are more spread out in rural areas. And when you start to look at that, it means an approach centered on compact, really, compact community-based districts, if it does not take into account some form of the demographics of that community, and I'm using demographics broadly here, then it can produce unintentional racialized gerrymanders. And an example in Pennsylvania, even with using communities of interest and really stretching that notion, you could end up with a map that looks pretty much skewed towards a non-inclusive and a non-equitable set of maps, if you will. And so the goal is to also make sure that we keep that at the forefront when we're thinking about the VRA, minority vote dilution, map drawing, and what it means to have an approach that is community of interest centered. And so at this point, we've been talking at you a lot about mapping. We hope folks are grounded in the baseline of the VRA and what it does as it relates to redistricting. But we have resources at www.redistrictingcommunitycollege.com. You're going to hear this over and over again, this website, you will see it. This is where these resources are housed. But I'm going to pause now and open up the floor for comments, discussion, and any questions. And for those of you who waved your hand earlier and said you know this like the back of your hand, we encourage you to also lean in as well. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see your beautiful faces and we can have dialogue about the VRA, et cetera. And Kathy, let me know how much time we got, depending on where we are in the presentation.
Great. So we have a good amount of time because we've merged the Q&A time from the intro with the VRA time. So I think we have a solid 30 minutes if we need it. So I'm going to start with a question that came from Connie Taylor. She asked, what kinds of protections with the Voting Rights Act, I'm guessing there's a missing word, have blocked the new voter suppression laws being enacted throughout the country. Jamal, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about some of the voter suppression laws that are trying to be enacted. I know we have some friends from Georgia. They might want to raise their hands and also try to answer that. And then, how is the Voting Rights Act being used to block that?
I'll do a framing, and this is relative to my organization, the NAACP, but it's reflective of what's happening around the country. As you all know, we have seen a wave of voter suppression legislation really blanket the nation, since the conclusion of the 2020 election. What we saw on January 6th in the nation's capital, where I live, literally a few blocks from my home, was horrendous. But what we're now seeing is sort of the backlash of voters turning out in mass and in droves, and in particular communities of color. And so in states like Georgia, I know Texas is on board, what's happening in Florida, it's bad legislation to literally suppress the vote. And so the introduction and the passage of these laws are really putting us in a process similar to what we experienced in 2011, after the rise of the Tea Party, and I'm saying this with my nonpartisan hat on, voter suppression laws became the state of play. And so what happened in Georgia, as you all know, in terms of the omnibus bill, if you will, around voter suppression, it passed. But then organizations like the NAACP, ACLU, Advancement Project, Lawyers Committee, we all jumped in and filed lawsuits using different premises in terms of the law, parts of it being based upon the Voting Rights Act, to counter the law itself. And so in many ways, we have to take it to court. We have to litigate and prove that it is a violation of either the Voting Rights Act or some nuances of the law in terms of voting. And so The sad part about that reality, and I'm saying this as a layperson, is it's a strategy done by some folks who are bad actors. You know, they many times lose in the courts, but it's expensive, it takes time, and by the time we get to a resolution, the damage could be done, meaning we could have gone through several elections at the state and local level, and because 2022 is coming, depending on how fast these cases get resolved in the terms of Georgia, will it be by the end of 22, or will these rules stand through 2022? And so that the disappointment in all of this is that we're gonna have to spend a lot of money and energy just to prove our case. And in many ways, we know that we're gonna win, but you have to go through the process. And by then, that's the daunting part about it. But I'm gonna be quiet because I heard there's some folks in Georgia who literally can speak to this, and maybe others who are wrestling with this in real time.
And I'm just going to note that Martha Zavala is echoing what you're saying, which is that the gutted portions of the VRA, Section 4, and the enacting part, Section 5, means that instead of being able to proactively block something from happening, you have to wait for the bad thing to happen and then sue over that, right? And so that's the hardest part. It's not that the Voting Rights Act still doesn't, it does have protections, but it's a whole different thing if you have to wait for the accident or the bad thing to happen. Yeah, do we have a friend or two from Georgia who wants to share? Because that certainly has been one of the hotbeds of voter suppression laws that have been passed very recently to try to block the surge of voter participation that state experienced in November and January. One of our Georgia friends want to come off mute and just share some of those battles?
Yeah, I live in South DeKalb County.
Hannah, introduce yourself first.
Oh, I'm sorry. My name it's Hannah Harris.
Hannah, hi.
And I live in South DeKalb County. It's unincorporated DeKalb County, and it is where the majority of the African American community is in that county. And so there have been a lot of efforts not only to break up what is a strong voting bloc for, well, obviously the Democratic Party, but they've also stifled efforts for us to become a city. We've been trying to do that for a couple of years, and they've stopped that because it would make us the second largest city in the state after Atlanta. And Stonecrest, which just incorporated as a city and is majority Black, would be the third largest city in the state. So, and it's right outside of South DeKalb. So they're very concerned about that. So they've been taking some actions to try to dilute our district, but it's hard for them to do because it's such a huge district where the county, our part of the county is so large. It's hard for them to convolute the map. It's hard for them to draw those crazy lines. But we were the
Thank you for sharing, Hannah.
Yeah, we were the strongest block. We put Ossoff and Warnock over the line, and we also put Biden-Harris over the line, just out of DeKalb County.
And not to take us off track about redistricting and what the VRA does, but there is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act that is in progress. And currently, Congressman G.K. Butterfield from the great state of North Carolina is leading a series of congressional hearings, because we've been told you have to have congressional hearings to prove that there is a crisis around Voting Rights Act because it meets a certain legal standard. Those hearings are going to take place and have to be concluded by late June. And then our congressional leaders will be voting on that act to really restore Section 5, which is the pre-clearance section that puts us more on the offensive than the defensive. So just wanted to note, there is a policy fix in addition to what's in S1 and HR 1 and S1 that's specifically for the Voting Rights Act to fix the hole that the Shelby decision created. And so we wanted to note that so that it's clear.
And you are answering a question that maybe gets a little bit at Catherine Davis's question. She's asking if the For the People Act, which is HR 1, addresses these kinds of problems at any level other than Congress. What I'll say is that the act that Jamal just talked about, which is HR 4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, that one actually would apply to every single level of redistricting, right? So it would create the kinds of bounds that the Voting Rights Act used to have in a very strong way for every level of line drawing, whether it's local, county, state, or congressional. The For the People Act is a little bit different, and those provisions apply to congressional redistricting. So just a quick answer to that, there's hope if you think about those two coming together and really kind of creating some of those really strong protections. I'm going to go to a question that came from Kathy Waters, who asked, she's curious about community of interest framing, where it comes from. Is it in the Voting Rights Act? It seems very similar to language from the National Labor Relations Act, or NLRA. And Jamal, if you want to take a stab, or I can, or Eduardo can.
I'll let you go first and I can round it out.
Okay. This language about communities of interest is not from the Voting Rights Act. It's actually a separate concept. So the Voting Rights Act, as Jamal laid out, has a pretty clear set of, who it protects and this set of rules that you've got to satisfy 1, 2, and 3 before you're going to be able to go to the court and say, hey, court, this district should be drawn like this or differently, or you should create a majority-minority district. Communities of interest is more considered to be a traditional redistricting concept that the courts sort of recognize. Sometimes it's spoken and sometimes it's unspoken. So what's interesting is that they recognize it the way they recognize that in redistricting, it is always an unspoken criteria that incumbents should be protected or parties should get a priority, right? There's just the courts have said, yeah, that's part of the rules that we play by. In some states, increasingly, we are seeing states put communities of interest as a concept and sometimes even a definition into their state laws or their state constitutions. So there are many states now that have a community of interest definition in their state law or state constitution. Then what I'll say is that depending on where you live at a local level, some cities and counties, and by extension, school boards, have also done the same thing. But it's by no means sort of a universal thing. So unlike the Voting Rights Act, which is a it's a federal law that applies to everybody, and it applies to all levels of redistricting, communities of interest is something where the courts have recognized it as a concept, and where many state constitutions and local charters have embedded it, but it's not necessarily something where it's consistent in language across every single jurisdiction.
And part of why we're lifting it up is that, it's a tool used in a proactive way to organize communities of color, and folks to start leaning in on what maps look like, so that as they go through the process, they have a center of gravity that can ground them. But by all means, it's not the only approach or the only ways to do it, but it's one that we're lifting up as sort of the forward-thinking approach, so that folks have a way to start conceptualizing what it could look like to draw maps together within your communities.
And actually, Connie Taylor brings up in the chat exactly the way that it plays out in some states, right? Which is that communities of interest is in their legislative guidelines, but it's not in a statute or a constitution. Their courts have recognized it, right? So just depending on the jurisdiction that you're in, and this is why it kind of matters, and we'll talk a little bit more about where you can find some resources to figure that out. But depending on where you live, at the state level, at the local level, this may be a concept that's embedded in state law. It may be a rule. It may be an understanding. It may be something that the courts have recognized, but it's not written down anywhere. And again, but it is a very powerful concept to bring up. Ayana Best, I hope I'm saying your name right, is asking, using the Pennsylvania example, how could these districts have been redrawn to be more equitable if communities of color are concentrated in certain areas? And I'll say one thing, just a small example. So folks remember that the League of Women Voters and friends brought a very successful lawsuit to challenge the Pennsylvania case, the Pennsylvania drawing of districts using their state constitution. There was this thing called the Free Elections Clause. And in doing so, the court said, okay, I recognize there's been some partisan gerrymandering. I'm going to unwind those maps. They first said, well, there's nothing in the Constitution that says who should draw this besides the state legislature. So I'm going to give the state legislature first crack. And that is the case in most places. And the state legislature, like fussy pants toddlers, said, no, we don't want to do anything. We refuse to redraw those lines. And so the court said, okay, fine, we'll bring in a special master. Now, the special master had only a very small amount of time to be able to draw those lines, wasn't able to sort of have full court public hearings. And so as a result, one of the smallest things that happened was that in the western part of Philadelphia, there was an African-American community that got split, right? And had there been community testimony and the ability to lift up maps of communities and neighborhoods, that might have been something that a mapper who was trying to be fair-minded could have paid attention to. I'm going to ask if there's folks on the line from Pennsylvania, or Jamal or Eduardo, if you want to add to that.
I can jump in.
I think you've covered it, but
go ahead, Jamal. Yeah, so my name is Suzanne Almeida. I work with the Common Cause national team. I think Pennsylvania is one of those interesting cases where it's an issue of margins, right? And so because we know that there can be such precision in redistricting, lines can be drawn even at the congressional level in ways that either advantage or disadvantage communities of color. I think that, the example that Kathy gave is a really good one. Another piece to this, and I think that it's important to think about, is as we drill down and as our districts get smaller and smaller with fewer people, there is more opportunity to really make sure that those districts are representative, right? So if a congressional district has, say, 700,000 people in it, it's going to be very difficult to kind of build power in some communities of color where there is not a large concentration of folks of color. So I'm thinking in Pennsylvania, like Lancaster County, Berks County, right? There's a high population of Latinx folks, but it is not as high as 700,000 people who create a whole district. And so, there's always this tension. However, when we're looking at Senate or state house districts, these are significantly smaller. We have 203 state house representatives in Pennsylvania, right? And so those districts, I think, are a really good step to making sure that those are drawn in a way to build power for communities of color.
Okay. I think that there's a couple of questions that are related to communities of interest, and we do have a little bit of time, so maybe I'll ask the question and see who wants to answer them. Linda Donaldson asked, so communities of interest goes beyond race?
Well, folks have already started answering that in the chat. So I see Trevor has just dropped a comprehensive answer. And so maybe Trevor, if you don't mind coming off mute and giving your perspective on this, that would be good. So you're not just hearing from us.
And Trevor, tell us what state you're from.
Hi there. I'm with Common Cause Ohio. And I've been doing a lot of the mapping with Districtor for different communities of interest here in Ohio. And so, yeah, I was just saying, communities of interest could really mean anything. The just community can mean a lot of different things to a lot of people. And, one person can be a member of many different communities. And so a community of interest could be any number of things, like I put there in the chat. Any community that shares certain resources, or school systems or public transit systems. It could be economic, folks who work in the same employment sector. It could be environmental folks who share the same water district or live in a mountainous region that is hard to get internet or phone service. So any number of things.
Yes, I promise we will talk a lot more about communities of interest in part 3, and you all will also get practice on one of 3 different redistricting apps, including the one that Trevor Martin talked about, District R, but also Representable, or DRA 2020, Dave's Redistricting App 2020, depending on what you signed up for. So I want to give a minute to Jamal and Eduardo to answer this question. We've talked a little bit about communities of interest, and I think actually many people on this call will end up trying to map their communities. But for that next level, if people want to do an analysis of the Voting Rights Act, or they want to connect with groups that are doing that kind of analysis so that they're part of a larger conversation, who do your organizations go to for doing a Voting Rights Act analysis or making sure that you're working in coalition? And maybe I could start, I don't know if Eduardo or Jamal, you want to answer that? And if there are other folks on the line who want to share, who does your organization go to when you get to that next level, not of mapping your own community, but of trying to figure out whether or not there are Voting Rights Act concerns or other larger districts concerns that you want to pay attention to?
I can start if that's okay. Again, this is Eduardo Sainz, the National Field Director with Mi Familia Vota. It's wonderful to work in coalition and to start ensuring that as we are maximizing and looking at our efforts, that we work in coalition. One of the best coalitions that I can give you an example, and not because I'm from Arizona, but it's been the One Arizona table, where we look for resources, we look for analysis. It's a table, a coalition table with more than 20 organizations that are fundraising together, that have the strategy together, and not only on redistricting, but also on electoral, voter registration, and then something very important I was mentioning earlier, our census count, to make sure that it's a fair count, to ensure that we have a fair start for redistricting. Organizations like the One Arizona table are compiled from Mi Familia Vota, grassroots organizations like Lucha, Chispa, and then there's also some national groups that are part of. But I think that it is very smart and very wise to ensure that we are collaborating, to ensure that efforts are not getting duplicated, but then that there is a joint front of ensuring that there is a fair redistricting for the next 10 years within this process.
And I would just echo what Eduardo lifted up, but give maybe a nuance. So for an organization like the NAACP, we do play in coalition at the national, state, and local level. We are at the State Voices tables. We're at tables that may not be incorporated with a national entity like in Mississippi. There's the C3 and C4 tables. But on the C3 side, we play in these coalition spaces on one hand, but we also have our own internal legal team, Office of General Counsel, and a volunteer cohort organized what is called legal redress committees. So in the state of Georgia and in the state of Alaska, there are NAACPers, volunteer lawyers who are organized at the state and local level as legal redress committee members, and they work with us on doing analytics around redistricting as it relates to what's happening currently with the malapportionment work, meaning the lawsuits that are moving, all the way into analyzing and looking at what are the legal interventions necessary state by state and even at the hyperlocal level if maps are drawn in a way that are seen as not being equitable or inclusive. And so it's a duality, if you will. And I would argue part of the beauty of being in spaces like this with our partners through the Charge Hub is that we can connect the dots, because it's not a one size fit all in every single state. In some states, it may be Common Cause, NAACP, and 10 local organizations have a redistricting cohort, versus in other states, it may be an established table that they're doing redistricting together on. And so we would argue that we would want folks to really think hyper-local. And when I say hyper-local, I'm thinking state and city/municipal level for what those coalitions could look like and what organizations are playing together, because 9 times out of 10, you're gonna find the legal analysis and the quantitative and qualitative analysis around maps, if you will, in those spaces.
I am appreciating that several people are starting to use the chat to share the coalition spaces that you're working in your own states. And I think this is super helpful, because sometimes you can have someone on a big call like this and they heard about the training, but they didn't realize that there was this fantastic conversation going on. And so folks should use the chat to share if you've got a coalition. And then I think also folks should share if your organization has a relationship with, or oftentimes uses or works with another organization to help you with thinking about the Voting Rights Act application or other legal questions. And so this is fantastic. Keep sharing that. I'm going to call really quickly on Yana Allen and Sandra Mitrovic. Yeah, I'm calling you out of the blue. Which legal groups do you all work with to help you think about questions like Voting Rights Act compliance?
Sure, Kathy, thank you for the opportunity. So with the National Congress of American Indians, we primarily work kind of with 2 different groups, but the Native American community is a little bit small in this sense. So we tend to partner a lot with the same folks. But the Native American Rights Fund is the primary resource and group that we work closely with on any kind of legal issues surrounding redistricting. In fact, they are hosting some of their own trainings as well. And we're looking to kind of co-host on a couple of training events in the future here in the coming weeks. But they are a fantastic resource. So if you all are interested, Sandra, if you wouldn't mind dropping in NARF's website for folks in the chat, that'd be great.
That'd be great.
So NARF is part of the Native American Voting Rights Coalition, and that group is also kind of, they always keep an eye on not just voting rights, but also things to do with census. And so naturally there is a little crossover, but NARF is kind of one of the leads there as well. So they're one of our closest partners in that space.
Great. And I see friends who are from APIA Vote and also Fair Count in Georgia. And so I'm going to ask that same question to you. When you think about sort of helping organizations get to a place where they're doing some Voting Rights Act analysis, who are you turning to help you out?
Hey, Kathy, this is Rebecca DeHart with Fair Count.
Hey there.
Today. So, I mean, I echo a lot that was said. We're lucky in Georgia, you know, to have a history of folks that have participated in redistricting, from knowing some personal attorneys who represented the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus in 2010 with the Bondurant firm, who does so much work with so many people, I think, that are on this call, you know, that we can go to for help, the organizational help that we've gotten from folks like Jamal said, the NAACP and others. And because of our work in the census, we really got coordinated, I think, with other legal efforts that allowed us to kind of bridge those connections so that when we have questions going forward, we can ask some of those organizations.
Fantastic. API Vote, Eric or anybody else want to share who you all go to for legal assistance?
Hi, Kathy. Eric Salcedo. Hi, everyone. Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Atlanta is, you know, one of our community partners down there. And I know they're part of a larger collective also, as well of coalition groups doing redistricting work and, you know, other types of civic engagement work. So I don't know if there are any other local Georgia organizations on the call that, you know, can better describe what that coalition looks like.
Yep. I think we've seen a couple of people pop up in the chat, the Georgia Redistricting Alliance and a couple of other alliances in different states, Tennessee, Minnesota. Really fantastic. Thank you for sharing Alabama. So I think, you know, this is a good opportunity for us to share that information. We're going to have opportunities for people to get into spaces in the breakouts to also share more information. I'm going to ask our friend Suzanne if she can pull up the slides. Great. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We are now going to be presenting Mapping Our Communities. The first part of this training is a training for trainers. And then we'll get into breakouts with workshops that'll feel a little bit more like the kind of workshops that you might have in your part of the country. My name is Kathy Fung, and I'm with Common Cause. Welcome back.
And I'm Sandra Mitrovich, and I'm with the National Congress of American Indians.
Great. Next slide. We are now in part 3 of the Redistricting Community College curriculum. And as I said before, we'll be covering a couple of things that are related to training for trainers. Next slide.
And in this session, we're going to cover what is community mapping, what does community mapping, or why does community mapping matter, as you heard a little bit previously in our discussion, and how do we actually run a community mapping workshop. And so right after this presentation, you're going to have an opportunity to participate in a breakout session. You're going to be able to practice mapping a community and learn about how to map using one of our free community mapping apps. Next slide. We want you to think about, you know, we talked a little bit about our communities of interest and how we do that. It's the easiest way to think about community mapping is to start with some 4 basic questions. Who we are as a community, what makes us special or unique, where we live, and how we share some of our common interests. Next slide.
This is the legal definition for communities of interest. You'll hear that term, communities of interest, a lot of times, and sometimes it'll be in state law, sometimes it'll be recognized by courts, sometimes it's an unspoken rule, as we talked about in the earlier sessions. This definition here, a community of interest, is a neighborhood or area whose residents have shared culture, history, and policy concerns, and would benefit from being represented in the same district. This definition is a definition that you'll see variations on in many state laws or even court cases. Traditionally, no one has bothered to ask people who live in a community or a neighborhood, what binds your community together? Often, redistricting is done in a top-down way, but the conversation and tools we'll go through today will give you the power to define your own community. Keeping communities together gives us a stronger voice in government. Next slide.
So what's exciting about this is really just getting started, that first step of redistricting. It starts with having local conversations about our communities and what the culture, concerns, and counts are of each. We call these the 3 Cs. We're going to look for stories that connect our community identity with impact. And so we really want to focus on how we tell our stories. We can start this community mapping now before the 2020 census data for redistricting is released, and we really want to encourage that. We can use American Community Survey data and free mapping apps to bolster the cases we're making for each of our communities. In the next slide, we're going to be looking at an example of those 3 Cs of culture, concerns, and counts. So when we're thinking about what community mapping is, I want us to first take a look at an example of a community. So on your screen, this is Chulista in Western Alaska. If you look at the quote, you're going to notice in this example, Walter Featherly, he actually joined one of our sessions on community mapping, and he talked about the identity of his Alaskan community known as Chulista. He He describes the location of the community, so note there. It's located in the Yukon, Kuskokwim Delta region of Western Alaska. And he talks about the challenges and in this quote of his community regarding barriers to transportation, and then also sometimes having to navigate that through river ice roads. So when we talk about the 3 Cs, you'll note all of those things there. The count of the 33,000 shareholders, obviously talks a little bit about the culture, and then of course where it's located. Next slide. So where does this fit into redistricting? So we want to think about, after many communities have mapped themselves, we want to build coalitions to work through where our shared interests lie. There's always strength in numbers. So anytime we can, we should identify places where there is agreement. We also need to be aware of places where there may not be agreement. Coalition building should always be constant. It can be critical to overcoming political opposition, as you have heard in earlier presentation. And we should always be asking who else needs to be at the table, what voices may not be present. Last but not least, this all builds up to district mapping. In most places, every level of government needs to be redistricted, from school boards to city councils to state legislatures and Congress. We're focused on teaching you how to map your communities, and there are ally groups that we will want to make sure that will look at how you have mapped your community, and then think about what coalitions are advocating for, and use all of that to draw the district map when we go through this process. Mapping districts can be complicated because there are a lot of factors to take into consideration, like making sure the districts are close to their ideal population, and also making sure they comply with the Voting Rights Act where there are minority populations. We heard a lot about that in our last segment. We won't go into depth in this session about how to draw districts, but you will be able to find some resources and groups that you can consult with, or how you can take trainings with one of the groups on the Charge Hub website. Next slide.
Let's talk a little bit about why community mapping matters. First, mapping communities can serve as building blocks for drawing the districts in a city or a state. Second, by collecting and telling community stories, we can center our communities in redistricting so that we're not just an afterthought, but we're actually considered from the start. Telling compelling community stories is essential to changing how the media covers redistricting so that they're not just covering it as a political power struggle between insiders, and they're starting to tell more stories about how redistricting impacts on regular people's lives. Most importantly, it can make a difference in how the lines are drawn, possibly by persuading those who have the power to draw lines, whether that's a lawmaker or a commissioner, to consider our communities. And it may be incredibly important evidence for judges to consider if the maps are challenged in court. Next slide.
Now I want to think through the role of everyone that can take part in running this workshop. In a community mapping workshop, there's going to be different roles for different people. As you'll note on the screen, we have a facilitator. That's the person who helps move along the conversation, making sure that we're identifying specific landmarks and areas that are really important to the community. Next is the community mapper. So we want to make sure that person is the one that listens to community conversations and will also help map the community. The ambassador is the next on the list, who really is well connected in the community. Those are the folks that can really bring people to the table. When they invite people, people are going to listen and they're going to show up to that workshop. And also think through who else needs to be a part of the conversation. And then last but not least, that helper person is going to handle the logistics of the day that may come up when we're participating in a training. Next slide.
So this is one way to run a community mapping workshop. You can obviously have variations, and so we welcome other folks to try out what works for conversations with you. What we like to start with is going around the room and having each person introduce themselves. Ask people to share what community they're from and one thing that's special to them about their community. Consider this to be an icebreaker, but even in this icebreaker, you should be, if you're the facilitator or the community mapper, taking good notes and listening really carefully. Are community members describing the same community? What are they saying about their culture or character of this community? Are they bringing up concerns? when people describe the places or events that they're tied to, make a note of it, because the community mapper maybe needs to use that later on when you're looking at the mapping app to be able to put that community onto the map. Next slide. The next step is to go around the room again and ask everybody, take a minute and write down how you would describe our community to a friend who's thinking about moving here. Now, we ask this as a question about a friend who's thinking about moving here, not just somebody who's visiting as a tourist, because we're looking for key places that are important to that community member that are worth marking on the map. Here are some tips for the facilitator and mapper. You want to write it down or share it in the chat. So if you're meeting in person, one day when we actually can meet in person, you want to have some paper and pens ready to use so that people can write things down. If you're meeting online, people can use the chat box and take a minute to write about their community in the chat box. The helper can help to save all the comments from the chat box so that you can save it in a separate document and hold on to that very important information. And remember to ask good questions. Participants might mention one or two places again and again, and you'll want to dig in a little bit with that. Ask them to share some more stories or tell them a little bit more about that place. You might want to ask participants, do you want to include that in your presentation or your testimony to the decision makers, right? So taking those notes are important to holding on to that information for later on, not only when you submit a map of your community, but also submitting testimony. Next slide. After some discussion, you'll want to think about whether people are all talking about the same place or multiple communities. Do people have the similar understanding or the same understanding of that community, or are there variations? If people are discussing more than one community, you can still map these, but you'll just want to be prepared to sort them out as you're talking so that you're mapping what one person might be saying and then coming back and overlaying or understanding what somebody else is saying. Next slide. Now let's talk about the 3 C's. The first C is for culture. These are some questions that you might ask to try to get at what culture is, right? What do we have in common? What's our shared history? Are there other things that we share, like language or celebrations or values? The second C is for concerns. The facilitator can ask questions to get the group to talk about what issues or services need resources or attention from the group. All right, when we talked about communities, sometimes they are unified by a shared racial identity or ethnic identity. Sometimes it might be that they all live close to a factory or a plant and they share a shared concern about both jobs, but also the health and environmental impact of that plant. The third C is for counts. You'll want to research additional data that can be used to strengthen our community stories about how we are, what our concerns are, and where we live. In the Redistricting Community Handbook, you can go to page 12 through 15, 12 and 15 through 17 to get more details about these 3 C's. Next slide. Now let's look at a real life example. And this helps us to sort of think about the 3 C's in a more concrete way. This is the port area of Long Beach in California. And sorry, a lot of my examples are from California because that's where I'm from. In 2001, in order to draw an incumbent into the California Senate District 28, legislators extended a quote unquote boot into the city of Long Beach to grab that incumbent's house. That's where that blue arrow is pointing to. That grabbed the incumbent's house. And that also meant that 2 other districts, Senate District 25 and 27, had to be drawn around the boot. This split multiple communities and the city of Long Beach into 3 districts. Next. Now let's look at the culture of this area. This area has a large Black community, and you can see that shaded in reds and oranges. There's also a mix of Latinx working class families. So when you go to a lot of family gatherings and community gatherings, you'll hear Spanish spoken as much as English. Now, what are some of the concerns? There are 2 ports, as I said, that are in this area. These Long Beach neighborhoods experience traffic and pollution from the nonstop caravans of 18-wheelers that are driving on the freeways, carrying goods that are shipped to and from these ports, right? They're picking up these cargo containers of things that people are ordering now that we're all in lockdown, right, to be delivered to their houses. And the families in these neighborhoods, like the Washington neighborhood, suffer serious health problems because of this pollution. As the story in this concerns part shows, Mrs. Zazueta talks about how the pollution means that her daughter has asthma and she has to be rushed to the hospital several times a week because she can't breathe. What are some counts that this community can talk about? One of the examples is the extent to which families have asthma. This area has so many asthma cases that it's called Asthma Alley. And as you can see, the rates of asthma are astronomical. The way communities are drawn impacts then how the districts are drawn. And the representatives who have the ports, who right now are not in the same districts as those who have the parts of communities that are experiencing health problems from the port traffic and pollution, makes a difference when those communities try to find representation to try to change or address that problem. Unifying neighborhoods that are impacted by the port traffic into one district could give those communities a chance to elect someone who would listen to and address their concerns. Next. So in 2011, when the community members came together to testify about their community and districts were redrawn by the California Redistricting Commission, that district was put or all of the communities were put into a single district. And those that were impacted by the Long Beach port and freeways now have a single voice. That new representative who was elected from this district has advanced multiple bills to address the health and environmental impacts of the trucks and ships on these communities. Next slide.
Well, I hope you're all ready now to get into our breakouts, because we're going to be trying out some new free mapping apps. So we have the Dave's Redistricting app, Districtor, and Representable. We're going to meet teams of people who can help bring these conversations to our community. We encourage you again to share those really unique stories in your breakout sessions. And you're going to stay in these same breakouts throughout the day as we have some additional breakouts with the other sessions. Right now, I'm going to turn the time back over to Lauren, our wonderful tech host, who's going to help facilitate getting us into our breakout rooms.
Okay, and it looks like we're all now back on this main screen. So we can pass it over to Suzanne and Eric.
Sorry, mute buttons are hard. Thank you so much, everyone. I am going to share my screen again, and then Eric is going to kick us off.
Hi, everyone. So we are in the stretch run of our training today. Thanks so much for your continued energy and participation as we charge forward. See what I did there. Thanks, Suzanne, for the laugh. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Eric Salcedo. I'm with APIA Vote, Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote. And we're going to very quickly and succinctly and hopefully clearly review the redistricting rules and timelines. But before that, I'll let Suzanne introduce herself as well.
Sure. Hey, everyone. My name is Suzanne Almeida. I work with the Common Cause National Redistricting Team.
Awesome. So today, our conversation will be in two parts. First, we're going to talk about the important questions to ask when you're doing research and preparing to submit testimony during the redistricting process. And then later, Suzanne and I, we're also going to be talking about the redistricting timeline, what to expect, when to expect it, and a deeper dive into two states, California and Georgia. Please keep in mind that this is not all the information, it's the very tip of the iceberg of all the information that you're going to need. But we're going to make sure that to share with you all the resources and where to find the information that you need at the end of this presentation. So first, what are like the questions that you need to keep in mind when you think about what your group is going to be doing for redistricting? One, what is the type of level of government that your redistricting wants to be involved in, right? We've all heard about on Monday, they did the reapportionment of congressional seats. So we know like, Texas is gaining 2 seats, California is losing 1 seat, there's that level. You may also want to think about how your state's legislative districts are drawn, because those may or may not change. At the county level, we have elected representatives, commissioners, boards of supervisors, or judges, and they make decisions about major social services, including health and safety and sheriff's departments. On the city level, you may be interested on how the city council or wards are drawn, and that's very important in terms of representation. And don't forget school boards, which are oftentimes the first place that a community that have traditionally been left out can have an impact in electing candidates of their choosing. So you'll also want to think about whether or not to get involved in submitting testimony about your community. And then also, are you trying to do more and try to draw a map of a proposed district, or even a small map of the districts in the state, county, and et cetera. So you need to think about what's the breadth and at what level do you want to think about testifying and drawing your lines of your district or your map. Each level of government, this is good to know, may have different rules for the who draws the lines, how a community can participate, and what is the timeline, right? Those are 3 huge things. Who draws the rules, who can participate, and what is the timeline, right? We have some information about each state's timelines that will be available in the rules for drawing the congressional, state, and local legislative districts. But just to reinforce, the 3 key questions that you'll ask at any type of level of redistricting that you're going to be doing is, again, who makes the decisions? When are the public hearings? And how do we submit information? By email, through a portal, in person? What's the deal? Then I'm going to toss it now to Suzanne. She's just going to quickly, am I doing this timeline real quick, right, Suzanne?
Yeah, I think so.
The thing I want to note in this timeline, see, it's different for each state, but note the mad scramble to draw districts, right, because of the impact of the pandemic in this process.
Yes. So thanks so much, Eric. Again, this is not all of the information that you all are going to need, right? But this is a taste and should get you thinking about the questions to ask. So we know apportionment data, which is that data that came out from the Census Bureau on, oh my gosh, it was like only Monday. It's been a very long week. About how many congressional seats each state's going to get. We are expecting what the Census Bureau is calling legacy data to come out in the middle to the end of August. So legacy data is not old data, it is current redistricting data in an older format. So it would need some processing by states or by map makers in order to be useful for redistricting. And then finally, we expect the redistricting data to come out by September 30th. And this is going to be the fancy tabulated bells and whistles package from the Census Bureau. And then, just to really highlight what Eric said, from October to the end of the year, we are looking at what is going to be an actual mad scramble. So that's why we're doing these trainings at this point, to really set us up for success towards the end of the fall. So how do we know that this timeline is different than we typically see? So I wanted to talk very quickly about how these census timelines are going to impact redistricting going on. We know that every state has their own timeline, and we know that, so there are about 3 buckets, right? There's sub buckets, but we're going to talk about 3. There are 2 states, New Jersey and Virginia, that have state legislative elections this year. That means that they are unable to hold those elections using 2020 census data. It's just not going to be available. So those states will hold elections using old district lines and then redistrict next year. There are 13 states that have redistricting deadlines before September 30th. And so those 13 states may need to ask the courts or the legislature or some other body in the state to move those deadlines. And there are states that are absolutely taking those steps in order to do that. So Oregon, California, Michigan, off the top of my head, but there are also more. And then finally, the third bucket is the states that have a candidate filing deadlines before March 1st, 2022. So this is important because we know that districts need to be in place in order for candidates to know where they're running and start running their campaigns. And so in states where that deadline is in March, it's important that those states look at other options, such as moving either the candidate filing deadline or their primary. I do want to note just one quick thing, that this says the revised schedule was by April 30th. It came out on April 26th. So we are, a little ahead of schedule, but not that much. This is just another visualization of what we ran through in the last slide. I am a person that likes to look at color-coded maps, so I figured I'd show it to you as well. You can see the 2, the 13, the 5, and the 5 here as well. And all of this information will be available both on redistrictingcommunitycollege.com and commoncause.com. So we are going to look at 2 states, and we're going to start with California. And the reason we are choosing California is that there are a number of you on the call today from California. For those of you who are not going to cover your states in this part of the presentation, please know that information does exist and is available. So this is the timeline for California. The California Independent Redistricting Commission went to court in the fall and asked the court to actually move their constitutional deadlines. They were successful, and really the important thing to look at here is the fact, A, they were proactive, and B, that they moved the deadlines in such a way to allow for enough public input. As Charge Hub members, one of the things that we're talking about today over and over, and you're going to get tired of us saying is that it's really about community input. It's really about people having a voice in where their district lines are drawn. And so when we're talking about moving these timelines and these deadlines, it's important that that is built into the process. So California also has not a few rules, right? So we know that the congressional and the state lines are both drawn by an independent redistricting commission, and that redistricting commission comes with a lot of rules about how they are drawn, when hearings are, and other things. There are also a lot of mapping rules in California, which is good, right? So we're seeing that there's federal equal population requirements and adherence to the Voting Rights Act. We talked about both of those things today. California has to adjust data to count incarcerated individuals at their last known residence. Some people call this prison gerrymandering reform. Districts have to be drawn with these criteria in priority order. So population equality, VRA, they must be contiguous, which means all points must touch. They have to preserve geographic integrity of existing jurisdictions and communities of interest, and when possible, encourage compactness. And then there's finally another requirement, which is nesting, which is kind of the epitome of the Venn diagram that we were talking about in that VRA section, which is where California Assembly and Senate districts must be nested. So 2 Assembly seats in each Senate district. I'm going to toss back to Eric.
Thanks, Suzanne. So wow, look at that. California, a lot of rules, a lot of protections for folks. What does it look like in Georgia, right? Here's the timeline, because every state's different, right? In terms of, where we are right now, in terms of taking the period of getting communities of interest testimony to when they start, putting together the hearings and such. They prep, and then they release the data, and then we have candidate filing, and then the election, right? Everyone has a timeline that's similar but different. For the Georgia rules, what are the mapping rules, right? There are very few rules. Unlike California, the ones that apply for Georgia, the Voting Rights Act, right? Making sure that it meets those regulations there, and contiguity, that all state legislative districts must be contiguous. Those are the rules. Who draws the lines? It's drawn by the state legislature, and both the congressional lines and the state legislative lines are drawn by the state legislature.
So that was a lot of information very quickly. All of this information, all of the slides you're seeing today are going to be available on redistrictingcommunitycollege.com or on the Common Cause website. We have additional timeline information up for many of the states and are slowly working to put all of that information up as we complete the research. And with that, only 2 minutes over, I am going to toss it back to Lauren.
We are now going to pass the floor to Elena and Janine and Alicia, I believe.
Great, thank you, Lauren. Let me share my screen. It's always difficult. All right, great. So, oops, that's the next one. So sorry. We are in section 5. My name is Elena again with State Voices. I am joined by Alicia. I don't know if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Alicia Guerreri, she, her pronouns, National Organizing Manager with the League of Women Voters US.
Great. And Janine, if you want to introduce yourself or if you want to wait until we get to the breakout section.
I'll introduce myself. Hi, I'm Janine Abrams-McLean. I'm the Vice President at Fair Count. Very happy to be here today.
Great. So we are here at part 5 for redistricting advocacy. And quickly, we're going to talk through why advocacy is important during redistricting, how to deliver our strong public testimony, which I think when we did that beginning poll, it was kind of split 50-50 on how folks were feeling about public testimony. We're going to talk about ways to increase accessibility and transparency in the process, and really how transparency and advocacy are connected. So first things, why it matters. Advocacy during redistricting can really give communities a voice and access into the political process. For many communities, they have not engaged in redistricting, and so this is a great opportunity for them to really start to have a conversation with elected officials or commissioners about their districts. Through advocacy, there may be better maps created that represent all communities, especially if there are a number of community of interest maps created. And then finally, it allows for community oversight in the process to build a record that communities turned out, they, supported maps, opposed maps, and just better transparency in the process. Skipping that. Engagement strategies. So these are just a few things to be thinking about as you start to plan your advocacy work. Your community should definitely get involved. Again, I think we've talked about this a lot, but public hearings can be a great place for that to happen, as well as community events or any other education opportunities. You'll want to research for your advocacy, research the timelines, rules, and process in your state or local area, what Suzanne and Eric were just talking about, making sure that you have that information. Being able to connect with civil rights experts in your area to either draft maps with a demographer or possibly talk with a litigator if you think that there is going to be pushback for the maps that are being proposed. And then finally, just being able to monitor the process, giving feedback on maps, if they meet your coalition's goals, how they could be strengthened, and just participating. So really quickly, I think everyone kind of has been operating in this virtual space for a while, but things to be thinking about as we continue probably in the virtual world. Virtual hearings are really effective, a great way to bring in community members. For that, we want to make sure that community members know where to go online, what platform is being used, and have all of their talking points for testimony prepared ahead of time. Written testimony is also helpful. The virtual public testimony that we just talked about. If your state does not offer virtual public testimony options, another suggestion is to maybe have like an unofficial record where community members can still participate in the process, give their feedback on maps, or share about their community and get involved if there's not an option at the state level. Another fun thing to think about for virtual testimony is creating like a watch party with your coalition so that you're hearing, you're at a hearing, but you're virtually connected and you can kind of react to the redistricting hearing as it's going on and share space and build community that way. Other things to think about is driving calls for advocacy to legislative or commission committees. These could be things like calls for better transparency, calls for supporting a map, and having a unified message there. You can also mobilize your community to turn out to these events and turn out to these advocacy actions through digital platforms like social media, but also texting, calling, emails, kind of using everything to just make sure that folks are getting the information. Or you could go the old school route and do like LTEs, op-eds, and more local newspapers. And then this is just a slide to quickly remind folks that the process is different between the legislative and independent commission states. They have different decision makers and oftentimes different processes for how the maps move through the process. And so as you're thinking about your advocacy work, it'll be just really important to look at what kinds of decision makers are associated with your process and make sure that you have like a plan to target the effective decision makers. And now I'm going to turn it over to Alicia.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm going to talk about transparency and accountability rules in redistricting, which is always super fun because we know that, from conflicts of interest to campaign finance violations, we have seen in cases our legislators sometimes can conduct their business unethically. So, which is why it's clear to us that we need real institutional measures to establish ethical rules that ensure our legislators and map drawers, commission members are serving the public good rather than their own interests. On this slide, there are a number of transparency issues, and I'm going to actually add in the chat a link to a report that if you wanted to dive deeper into these, but this really is how we give these types of transparency and accountability rules give members of the public and communities of interest an opportunity to participate in the redistricting process, and that helps ensure electoral maps are drawn in a fair and open manner. Again, you could read through these more deeply, but there are three that I just wanted to pull out and make sure everybody saw, which includes commission should require a minimal number of meetings or public hearings throughout the state. They should require all draft maps and reports to be released on a publicly accessible website. And another one I wanted to highlight is requiring a reasonable public comment period for proposed maps. Again, what we've gone through is how important it is for community and people to be able to have a voice in this process. You could go to the next slide. Testifying is advocacy power. Again, as you saw, a key part of the transparency and accountability rules means that the public is part of the process, and testifying is really a crucial opportunity to exercise our voice and our power to ensure our communities are represented and protected. This is both building skills for you, your organization, and community. This also applies to any issue and can be taken into and practiced, you know, for redistricting and beyond. It gets you and your organization on the record, which is also important, you know, later down in the redistricting process when we are able to see who and how many people were able to comment. Helps build coalitions and get media attention as well. Okay, good. So just a quick word on preparing your testimony. Want to make sure that everybody knows what it means. We'll be talking about both testifying and testimony. Testimony is defined as a declaration or statement given in evidence. So it's a written document that contains what will be said in the testifying process. And then finally wanted to just provide an example. I know the writing is quite small. I don't expect anybody to be able to read this, but this is an example of a letter of testimony that was submitted in Washington State. And you know, if you were to read it, if somebody were to read this, they could see how it includes information about the writer, who they are, and what is at stake for them, and why they have the right voice to be talking on this. It includes an ask and has an example of what the writer is asking for, as well as reasons and facts that support their position. And I know we will be diving deeper into these components.
Sorry, I thought I skipped a slide. Great. So now talking about just preparing your testimony as part of the advocacy and you know, ways to keep the process open and transparent. For your testimony, there's a few key parts. First, your introduction. So you'll want to introduce yourself, any organization that you're with, maybe the coalition or your community that you work with, being clear on your goals for the testimony and why you are there speaking today. You'll want to tell your story, either your story of self or your story of the community and why it's really important. Your testimony could call for a specific solution. Maybe that is supporting a proposed map or sharing your community of interest map. And then use notes if necessary. The testimony process for many states to speak in front of a commission or a committee is really short. Some states are 2 minutes, some states are up to 5 minutes, but you want to make sure to be really concise. And then after you do your introductions, you'll want to define what your community looks like, defining the uniqueness about your community, what is special about the community, all of the geographic and structural boundaries in your neighborhood, whether that is a park, an airport, like a library, city hall. I think all of those things came up during our mapping demo. But just making sure that that is brought up, and then through that being able to share and explain your community of interest map if you are bringing one.
And a quick word on, just like Elena said, you are typically given a very short amount of time, but there are some instances in which folks ask questions. So you do want to make sure that you are prepared to respond to opposing viewpoints and able to defend your position. Again, echoing previous points made about being very clear about the points that you're being asked and really being certain about what you want to come across. In the case that you are asked a question, that you aren't sure the answer to, you can just say that you don't know, but assure them that you will get back to them with an answer to their question.
Great. And then just to wrap everything up and to tie it back to, I think, section 2 or section 3. Sorry, creating stories with the 3 C's. And so in your testimony, again, mentioning the culture, what people are part of the community, the concerns that you have that need attention from the government, and then any counts, data, demographic information that can be used in your testimony can also be really impactful. And now we're going to launch into our breakout. We'll start with a video on public testimony starring Janine Abrams-McLean. And I think Lauren is going to set that up for us.
Yes. All right, here you guys are.
We can hear the music, but not see the video.
Oh, thank you. Give me 1 second. All righty, take 2, here we go.
We will now hear a testimonial from Nicole Kindred regarding district maps for the Peopleton County School District.
Hi, I've lived here for a long time, and the county has changed. I know that it's changed because I volunteered to help make sure people were counted in the 2020 census. Plus, you can look around and see that there are way more people of color living here now. I'd even dare to say that people of color are probably now the majority in Peopleton County. Unfortunately, since I've been here, we've only had 1 school board member who was a person of color, 1. And I bet it's because of the way the school district lines are drawn. Look, if we keep the same maps for the next decade, absolutely nothing is going to change. As a mother of 3 school-age children, I have concerns, and redrawing the lines will help us have a better chance of electing people that really represent us. So I'm asking the commission, I'm asking you to draw better districts for the diverse communities of Peopleton County. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kindred.
Great. So I think Lauren is going to sort us into breakouts right now. We'll have a facilitator in each group to talk through the testimony example that we just provided. We have some questions that will be asked, and then we'll come back and do a quick debrief and give another version of the testimony.
We will now hear a testimonial from Nicole Kindred regarding district maps for the Peopleton County School District.
Thank you, Commissioner Franklin. Hi, my name is Nicole Kindred, and I've lived in Peopleton County for 15 years. I'm here today with a concerned group of parents, teachers, and neighbors who are invested in the success of the Peopleton County School District. And we all believe that the district lines need to be redrawn. In 2020, I was an active member of the Peopleton County Complete Count Committee, and I helped make sure that we had an accurate count in the 2020 census. Recently released census data showed that our county's population has increased by 23% since the 2010 census, and that most of that growth has been driven by increases in Black, Latinx, and Asian populations. In fact, based on those numbers, people of color now make up 63% of Peopleton County's population. Unfortunately, only one of our 5 school board seats is held by a person of color, only one. And keeping the district lines as they are currently drawn provides fewer opportunities for communities of color to elect candidates that reflect the needs of the community. As a mother of 3 school-age children, and as a friend of parents that live in both affluent and less affluent areas of the county, I know how important it is for everyone's voice to be equally heard. After talking to my diverse neighbors and friends all over the Peopleton County School District, I know our community's concerns and that we need elected officials that can understand and address those concerns. Therefore, I implore the commission to take the new population and demographic data into account when redrawing school district lines, so that all residents of Peopleton County can have the opportunity to elect school board members that truly represent them. Thank you.
All right. So in this session, we're going to cover coalition building, stakeholder engagement, and organizing strategies. Again, my name is Elena. I am with State Voices, and I am joined for this session by Marika and Jamanish from Faircount, if y'all want to introduce yourselves now.
Hi, I'm Jamanish. Marika?
Hey y'all, I'm Marika. We're both redistricting coordinators at Faircount.
Great. So we are again at the end of our curriculum on part 6. And for this session, we're going to talk about coalitions, why they're helpful during redistricting, who should be involved in these coalitions, and what are the effective organizing strategies. And then we'll wrap up with a great example from our folks in Faircount, and then a short breakout session to talk more about coalition building. So coalition building 101. On the screen right now are just some basic questions that as you start building a coalition, you should be thinking about. The first thing is that if you do not have a coalition for your redistricting efforts, either in your state or locality at this point, you should start working on that now, because it takes a good bit of time to organize something like that, to build trust with your community members, and can be really helpful for redistricting as it approaches in the fall. You'll want to clarify what your goals of the coalition are. Are you trying to just look at transparency and increase public participation? Are you actively trying to get lots of folks to public comment? Are you really interested in creating your community of interest maps? Maybe it's all of them, but just to know what your goal is can get you to the second question of figuring out how you're going to be successful in these efforts. Once you figure out your goals and success marks, think about what skills you need for your coalition. These could be communication skills. We heard in the breakouts a lot around, press and comms and LTE placements. And so maybe that's something that your coalition wants to highlight. It could also be the need for digital organizing or more community engagement. So thinking through the skills that you'll need can also address what gaps you have. And then once you think of those things, really that will kind of clarify who should be involved. Maybe it's a broad coalition and you're trying to include everyone in your community or in your county, but maybe you want to have a small and narrow focus and just include, say, Asian Americans in a specific part of a community. After you think through kind of some of the basics for coalition building, we can go through an exercise called a power analysis. This can be a helpful tool to evaluate who the decision makers are, who the leaders are in the community, And then what are some of the strategies that are needed to build power? Trusted leaders. These are folks that can have the ability to influence others, garner support for the proposed maps, or really be influential when you're presenting your COI maps. You'll want to think about who is going to oppose your plan. Again, that goes back to who the decision makers are in your state or locality. And then who could maybe be in the proverbial middle and be brought to one side or another. You'll want to think of effective messages and messengers within your community. What are the things that your community cares most about, and how can redistricting fit within that message? And then who the experts are in the community. These could be community members themselves, folks that have lived there for like 50 years, but it could also be data experts, it could be lawyers, it could be professors. So thinking about that stuff in advance can help you build out who should be in the coalition. Additional things to consider. You'll want to be mindful of the community differences and maybe some conflicts. It is safe to say that because redistricting is all about drawing a community, keeping communities together, some groups may have a different interpretation of how those maps should be drawn, and so be mindful of that. The next thing is to just know that your typical voting rights or civic engagement allies might not always share the same goals with redistricting as you do. And so having conversations about what the goals for your coalition are early and often can help mitigate some of that confusion. And then finally, just remember that every person in your coalition will probably have a different understanding of the process. And so it's helpful to do things like this, come to a 101 training where you can all get on the same page and understand what redistricting looks like in your state. Additional considerations. You'll want to recruit around a shared value or vision set of concerns. You'll want to create a shared timeline for the coalition. These could be things like your community events or when you want to get press attention, and can help you really make sure that your coalition is functioning strategically. Coordinating around a unified message can be helpful for advocacy, and when you turn out for public hearings, it can be helpful to have, say, one message of keep this X community together, and here is the one main reason why, than having 10 people saying different things. That can get confusing for a commissioner or legislator. Your coalition can create a shared mapping plan. This could, again, be what we've been kind of talking about throughout the day, a COI map, but there's other maps options available as well. And then finally, don't stop until until after the maps are finalized. Sometimes maps will go to court. There will be lawsuits that your organization and advocates can be helpful with. And so just think about, after the maps are finalized, what else might be needing to be done. And then finally, just thinking of long-term strategies in redistricting. Redistricting is something that happens once every 10 years, but we know that it is really important and really tied to a lot of the programs and policies that we work on, in the in-between time. And so if we're able to integrate redistricting education into existing programs, like maybe we did with the census, or other voting rights work, that can be helpful in just keeping redistricting top of mind. Building capacity for communities. Through this redistricting work, we can have more folks know how to draw maps in the future, know how to provide testimony, and have a better understanding of how advocacy works. And then finally, being able to just use community-centered narratives to tie redistricting to the everyday issues that folks are already interested in and care about. And now I'm going to turn to Marika and Jamanish to give an example of how they've used COVID-19 recovery for a redistricting coalition building.
Hi, again, I am Jamanish Antenna and Marika.
And I'm Marika Kilstra, and we're both redistricting coordinators at Faircount. So we're going to be taking the steps that Elena just discussed and applying them to a few specific examples to illustrate the process. So we're going to talk through it using COVID-19 recovery as a tactic for building a redistricting coalition and thinking through how this might be particularly useful if we end up in a fight over the use of CVAP data or citizen voting age population data. Then we'll have a short breakout session to give you all a chance to think through the process in your own state. Next slide, please.
There you go. We use COVID recovery as an example because we have seen the data that shows that the same communities that were undercounted in the census are nearly the exact same communities that have experienced access issues in vaccine dissemination. This leads us to believe that these are some of the communities most at risk of losing their voice in redistricting. As Faircount built its COVID-19 coalition, we first clarified our coalition's purpose and goals. We wanted to engage rural communities of color to improve access to vaccines and vaccine information, and to make sure in the long term that they are empowered to participate in the redistricting process, have their voices heard, and be fairly represented and able to elect the leaders they choose. We found at Faircount that tying COVID to civic engagement has been the most effective way to keep people engaged, and it forces us to think through the hard questions. Why should people care about redistricting when their grandparents are in the hospital and they can't find a job? Why does redistricting matter if families are struggling to put food on the table? We need to meet people where they are, through the issues that are directly affecting their everyday lives. Using data analysis and our organizing team on the ground, we identified places and people particularly impacted by the pandemic. Since we're approaching redistricting from a COVID lens, we can approach people who otherwise might be harder to reach or aren't already in the nonprofit or organizing sphere. We focus on putting people most impacted by COVID first: teachers, medical providers, parents, frontline workers, factory workers, poultry plant workers, etc. We looked at the data to identify counties and cities that were hit particularly hard and worked to develop contacts or leverage existing relationships in these places. We asked how we could help and tried to do so however we could by providing PPE, sponsoring food banks, and supporting community events. Once we've identified goals and potential coalition partners, then we can begin training people on tools like Representable or other community mapping tools that will allow them to engage in community mapping that defines what's important to their communities or a community of interest. During this process, we'll stay engaged with our partners and incorporate feedback into future plans to better serve these communities. Next slide, please. Once we identified potential partners and started bringing them to the table, we then determined what skills our coalition has and what we needed help with, and we tried to fill the gaps. For redistricting, that could mean map training, training on testifying before the legislature, providing general information on redistricting, and producing media engagement tools in multiple languages. Right now, we're in the process of developing internal and external trainings and materials to share with our partners. It's important to understand what skills and tools your coalition already has: a widely developed base of support, mailing lists, trust within their communities, social media presence, strong information sharing networks, language capacity, leadership skills, etc. Once you've identified these skills and tools your coalition will need, conduct trainings or direct your coalition members to trainings and resources that will enhance the skills necessary to achieve your goals. Next slide, please.
So we'd like to work through a more specific example tying COVID-19 recovery to CVAP, which is citizen voting age population data, which some people are pushing to use for redistricting. Using CVAP would exclude non-citizen immigrants and children from representation and consideration in how our maps are drawn. So in working to build a coalition against using CVAP data, we want to start by thinking about the people who would be the most impacted by the use of this data, primarily immigrant communities, children, and parents. So in our coalition, we'd want nurses, pediatricians, boys and girls clubs, immigrant community organizations, immigrant rights activists, parents, teachers, school administrators, childcare professionals, social workers. We want baby shark, we want grandpa shark, we want grandma shark, we want everyone. We want everyone who's impacted by CVAP data. So once we've identified those who would be the most impacted by CVAP, we can engage communities in conversation about how they're being impacted right now by COVID-19. So right now, many teachers are teaching virtually and in person. Many parents are working from home while schooling their kids or are struggling to find childcare. Many immigrant communities are wary of government-led vaccine efforts and struggling without access to healthcare, economic stimulus, or multilingual information about vaccines or the support available to them. So we can ask them, have your local elected officials, your state legislators, your congressional member, have they been helpful during this time? Have they heard your needs and helped to provide solutions to them? Has your community been heard? So after we've identified our goals in our coalition, next we have to identify the tools and skills that coalition will need to achieve these goals. So that could mean multilingual and culturally relevant materials that are sensitive to specific communities' needs and concerns. It could mean training on how to give impactful testimony like Janine gave earlier. It could mean information about redistricting and the safety of testifying for undocumented folks. It could mean map training, how to call state legislators, how to run social media campaigns, organize letter writing campaigns, and all the other ways you can put pressure on elected officials to listen to their communities. There's a lot of options. Next slide, please. So now that we've gone through those steps of coalition building, we'd like to go into a short 15-minute breakout session for you to try this process for yourself. So try to think about how you would build a coalition centered around COVID and redistricting in your state or region. Think through your own examples, coalition partners, goals, and what tools you would be able to offer. What specific organizations and individuals would you want involved, and what skills could you offer them? So we'll give you 15 minutes for this activity. Facilitators, please make sure to copy these questions down to discuss in your breakout rooms, and thank y'all.
And again, just thank you all so much for joining us today. And for being a part of this effort to draw maps, draw fair maps and ensure fair representation for everyone. We really wish you all the best of success in this effort, and we're here to do everything that we can to help you in the fight for a just democracy.